Okay, thank you then. In that case, let's get started. Welcome everybody to this open group webinar on SOA governance. I'm Chris Harding. I'm the Open Group Forum Director for SOA, and I will act as host for this webinar. The presentations themselves will be given by two of my colleagues, Jorge Diaz and Heather Krieger. This is the first of a set of webinars which we are giving to present the Open Group SOA Governance Framework, which was recently published. Governance is widely recognized to be a crucial factor for the successful adoption and use of SOA within an enterprise, and we have had a team of Open Group members working on an SOA governance standard for some time now. That standard was published earlier this year, and the purpose of this webinar is to explain it. It will be followed by other webinars for people within and outside the Open Group, and at times convenient for people in not only in the Americas, which this one is primarily intended for, but also for Europe and Asia. This webinar will be presented, as I said, by the presentations will be given by Jorge Diaz and Heather Krieger. We have a team of presenters from various companies. It so happens that both of these two are from IBM. Jorge is an executive IT architect within IBM Software Services for WebSphere, where he leads the SOA governance delivery area. He provides governance and solution architecture consulting for IBM's software portfolio. He has extensive experience in a variety of industries and a proven track record of leadership with large customers adopting SOA. Jorge holds a BS in computer science, a Master of Software Engineering, and a variety of technical certifications. He is a steering committee member of the Open Group's SOA Working Group and co-chair of its upcoming SOA governance specification. He is a senior member of the IEEE and a member of ACM and SEI. He is a frequent speaker and author, and he will be starting with the first part of the presentation. Heather, who is also from IBM, is a specialist in standards, and she works in the IBM standards area. She is a member of the IBM Academy of Technology and the author of Java and JMX, Building Manageable Systems. So we're now going to hear from her about governing those systems. And she will be giving the second part of the presentation. Before I hand over to Jorge, just one piece of housekeeping I'd like to ask. If you have questions on the material as we go through, please will you use the Q&A facility, the WebEx Q&A facility, to input those questions, and we'll try and ask our presenters to give some answers at the end of the meeting. Okay, so thank you all for that, and without further ado, I will hand over to Jorge.
Thank you, Chris. Very kind of you. So moving on to the next slide. All right, so it works. So slide number 2, a little bit of the agenda that we're going to discuss today. We're going to go over what particularly definitions we're focusing for SOA governance. I mean, there are various opinions out there. So for this specification, we make sure that we all were in sync, and that's what we're going to share with you today. We're going to also discuss the value of such standard, why we really felt that and feel that that standard on SOA governance is important. After that, we're going to go into the particulars of the framework, and Heather will help us understand the various parts of it, etc. And we're going to then do a quick summary. So feel free to type your questions, and we're going to have time at the end for a Q&A. All right, so first slide, what SOA governance is about, and really, every time that I think about this, I mean, it boils down, regardless of what type of governance that you're talking about, about defining chains of responsibility, policies, and control points to drive behavior. So there are various ways of achieving SOA, and along the way, when you're creating solutions, there will be many things that will get on the way of achieving your goal. And hopefully governance is bringing all of those contextual and governing processes to the fore so that people can focus on addressing that and creating the right ecosystem for solutions to be successful. So the point with the framework is that it brings them all together so that you don't forget about the important things. So that's key. And applying it, those three things that I mentioned before, the chains of responsibility, policies, control points to SOA governance, is important, but also not to forget that SOA governance lives on a greater context, that we can see it on the next slide, which is that they're more than likely going to be some sort of business governance, so some corporate entity that defines the vision that the company should follow. There is going to be particular IT governance efforts that they are also focusing on putting chains of responsibility, policies, and control points at a much higher scope. And of course, from an architectural perspective, there may be an EA governance as well that is looking at defining what proper governance mechanisms should be on a particular scope, for example, a review board or so on. So governance, SOA governance specifically, extends all of those facilities and adds the proper mechanisms that need to be there for an SOA solution. So when we're talking about SOA governance, we don't think that it lives on its own cocoon, but it's part of this greater good, I guess, of the corporation. The various organizations are working together, but so it's a dynamics that need to be built and all that through the mechanisms that we're going to show hopefully later on in the governance framework. So moving on to 5, the reason why we felt that this was important is because we were seeing that the topic of SOA governance was being approached from many different perspectives, and many of them did not align too properly, even from different vendors in the same kind of going after the same market. Some of the things were not aligned. Customers were providing feedback that they really were a bit confused on how to move forward. So by having a standard being developed on a place like the Open Group, which is vendor independent and which customers and vendors can collaborate on a non-threatening way, certainly reduces the risk of coming up with crazy approaches that cannot be integrated. So we can also share best practices and all of this. So all that sharing was incorporated into what came up to be this specification. So it certainly gave us a common foundation of understanding so that we can build further value add on top of that. Many of the things defined in the specification are things that used to take a lot of time to really define, and now we hope that by putting them on a standard, people can just take the standard and build more or further business value quickly. So certainly being vendor neutral is one of the key areas there, and it was very much a consensus driven in that it was not driven by one particular point of view fully, but it was very much an agreement of open group members. All right, so the scope, whenever you're thinking about governance in general, also ties people, technology, and processes. But certainly from an SOA perspective, that's not the exception. I mean, for the people, you have to think about whether the current organization is going to be affected, whether there needs to be things like matrix, virtual teams to push forward the behavior needed, and to come up with the policies that are necessary to achieve the objective. So in our model, you're going to see that when you read it, that we define things like a center of excellence and the roles that play a part in that. But people need to have particular processes to sort of enforce some of those policies. So what processes we're talking about? I mean, what are relevant from a governance model? What kind of processes should be defined to actually monitor those processes? That all of that was discussed as well many times, and the framework documents that and provides some guidance. One area that is certainly important, because the processes and the people, there's quite a bit that will be done there, but I hope that there is some automation so that we become more efficient, and some of the, for example, for the compliance part and others, hopefully technology is moving us forward in that. But we discuss a bit, but don't go into too specifics, and mainly to help give the market a place to differentiate themselves. But for sure, technology and tools are part of that triangle of value that we've been trying to capture in this particular framework specification. All right, so as we can see in slide 7, we divided the work into the definition of a variety of key concepts and key areas, and Heather is going to explain in more detail what each of these are. But you can think of the reference model for SOA governance being the area in which we tie together the various concepts, so that dynamics between people, process, and technology. That for a corporation would be, if you get, for example, if you download the specification and read it, you'll see that it's very much a reference model, right? It's not something that you can just get and plug into your own organization. There has to be some tailoring, certain things that you will modify or add, etc. And for that, we came up with a particular set of activities that we roll into a method called the SOA Governance Vitality Method. There's a variety of phases that you go through from that enable you to go from that reference model to a customized and focused SOA governance regime. So that is what you would like to get at the end, and that is what you would realize within your corporation. So it's a transformation that keeps, I think, the governance within your efforts vital. So you're going to go through that method over and over again as new things get changed. I mean, every place there are acquisitions, and there's movement of people, new technology, etc. So it's not meant to say that you go through one flow of this and then you're set, but it's an ongoing thing, iterative, like most things in life nowadays. And we did make a difference between governance and management, being that the governance is more on the strategy side, laying out what needs to be done, and the management is actually realizing that with specifics. All right, so going to slide 8, just a little bit of zooming into what we meant by the reference model. And I've discussed some of these things already, but let me just reiterate a couple points. Certainly, without guiding principles, it will be really hard to put some constraints and understand what are your boundaries in your scope. So that is one area that we make sure that within the specification we clarify, and those guiding principles will help whenever one is defining the governing processes, and we're gonna hear later on this presentation what those are, but the processes that are helping nanny, if you will, the actual processes, the governed process that you want to really make sure that are executed correctly. So how you're coming up with solutions, etc. And of course, along the way, within any model, there are things that those processes have as inputs and things that they have as outputs, and we make sure that we clarify that as well in the specification. The other two things, the roles and responsibilities in technology, there are many people involved, and I mentioned as well before that the technology is at the core, so I think that I covered that, and we can, they may be explained a little bit more later on. If not, we can expand on that after that and in the Q&A section. So that's it. Heather, feel free to keep going.
All right, thank you, Jorge. Now I'm going to take you into a little bit more detail on each of the elements of the reference model as well as the vitality cycle. So the first thing is Jorge was talking about is the guiding principles. So these are important because they actually provide you the razor by which you judge what the right priority and how to make your decisions for your SOA and how you want your SOA governance to apply to it. Now, the standard does provide a set of best practices principles that you can pick and choose among or extend, and we actually expect that you'll create your own that are specific to your own company as you start down developing your own governance regimen. So these are some examples of some of the guiding principles. You can see they're very, very generic. So conformance to your organization's existing business governance, conformance to your enterprise architecture or SOA reference architecture that you have in place, making sure that you have a funding model for the governance work that's starting to begin are all good examples. The next element of the reference model we're going to talk about are the roles and responsibilities. So we think it's key to be able to establish up front exactly who the stakeholders are in your SOA and in the governance of that SOA. And since one of the key values from SOA is this alignment of business and IT, and one of the key values of governance of that is to make sure that you actually achieve that alignment and maintain the alignment. It's especially important to have steering boards and SOA governance boards with members from both your business and IT communities. So the steering board provides your executive level guidance, and they are responsible for helping define these principles that are important for deciding on the funding. And then you have a SOA governance board that is usually useful to have in place because it can actually act as a focal point for the definition and the development of the governance regimen, putting it in place, the compliance processes that are going on, and how to deal with the exceptions as they come through. And of course, all this pushes down on the execution and delivery teams in the environment. Now you can see that there's quite a variety of stakeholders and people involved in the governance process, everyone from the executives down to your delivery teams. I think this feeds in well to understanding what the governing processes are. Now, these are the processes that we put in place in order to actually make the governance work. So there's three big categories of processes that are important here. The first one is the compliance process. So this actually provides a mechanism for you to be able to understand if your current SOA solutions are staying within the boundaries of your business objectives. Are you maintaining that business IT alignment? Are the policies being complied to? Are checkpoints and metrics being met? And typically they're put in place via checkpoints at certain points in the development process or in the operational aspects of your SOA solution in your environment. And metrics are often used in these checkpoints to verify that things are within appropriate policies. Now, if you have a checkpoint and it fails that test, then you have to have a dispensation process available to you. And basically, this allows you to deal with the exceptions. It allows you to appeal for the noncompliance that has occurred. So several things can occur upon an appeal. You can be told to go back and fix the problem and get back into compliance again. You could also be given a one-time grant of an exception because this might be a one-time event that's an exception. Maybe some physical storm or something has caused us not be able to meet our quotas. And then finally, if you get enough of these exceptions to the rules, this causes you to step back and take a look and make sure that your policies and the governance that you have in place are appropriate for the environment. And this is the trigger now for us to be able to evaluate and go through the vitality model to make sure that we maintain that alignment. And finally, communication. As I pointed out before, the number of people involved in governance is quite wide, and you need ways to be able to communicate with that community, have them understand how important they are to making sure that the governance and the SOA solutions are successful, and making sure that they can get access to the information, the policies, the metrics, the checkpoints, the processes when they need them. So let's take a look at the governed processes. So in any SOA, or in most companies that have SOA solutions deployed, there's going to be sets of processes. So you're going to have a solution management process or solution portfolio management process. What solutions do you need? Business solutions do you need? Which ones do you actually use SOA to support? And then from there you understand what services do you need. And so you have service portfolio management as well, where the services are identified, who's going to pay for them, how they are reused, and what requirements come from the various solutions. Now, that's sort of around identification and development. Obviously, you also need to have a life cycle for both the solutions and the services so that you can, once they're identified, you can get them developed and deployed and then operationally managed. And the governing processes that you just talked about actually apply to all of these different SOA processes. So we need to be able to make sure that we comply when we develop new services and that the operational life cycle, they're staying within bounds for performance and security, et cetera. Another key aspect of the SOA reference model, the governance reference model, is the technology needed. And this is actually technology needed to support the SOA governance itself versus supporting the SOA in general. And sometimes you can use the same technologies to support both the SOA and the SOA governance aspects, and this is expected. So we wanted to really talk about the technology in terms of the capabilities that it provides. So, for example, we need to store an access capability. We need some place to store the policies and the procedures, as well as any other artifacts for checkpoints and metrics and dispensations that have been stored. So we need a place to store those and a way to access them, again, generally online. So things like repositories and websites are often used there. We also need the ability to enforce policy. We need the ability to monitor your existing SOA solutions and services that have been deployed in your environment. There are a lot of monitoring tools available in the market today. You need to be able to manage the configuration of those things. And often workflow is very useful for governance as well. We've talked about compliance and dispensation processes, and it's easy to see that using workflow technologies could help you automate some of those processes. All right, now we're going to move on to the governance vitality model. And don't forget, we'll take questions at the end. If you have questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the Q&A on the WebEx. And we'll address them at the end. So the SOA governance vitality model. This is actually cyclical, and as Jorge pointed out to before, governance is not a one-time deal. You have to deploy your initial governance, of course, and this cycle definitely helps you get this initial deployment of your governance. But it's an ongoing thing, and as your company and as your SOA matures and as your requirements change, you need to redevelop your governance. You also can deploy governance in a roadmap fashion. In other words, take a look at what your immediate needs are, what your long-term vision is, develop a reasonable roadmap for achieving that vision in terms of a series of runs through this vitality model. So the steps for the vitality model are planning for your governance, defining your governance, what the regimen is going to be, implementing it, and then monitoring it. And that monitoring is the key aspect with the compliance and the dispensation processes that we talked about. So let's take a closer look at the plan phase and what the different aspects of the plan phase are. So first, let's talk about this as if this was our first time through developing a governance regimen for a particular SOA solution. So first we have to understand what are the governance structures that are available to us that might apply. We really don't want to reinvent parallel governance mechanisms and infrastructures. What we really want to do is leverage the ones that are there and weave them in together with the right SOA governance. So it's important to understand what's currently available. Some of those may need to change to accommodate the SOA governance that might be necessary. You also need to look at your SOA maturity. So what are your goals for using SOA? Do you want a very dynamic and real-time environment driven by business processes? Or do you have a simpler scenario for right now where you're trying to integrate with certain partners or solve certain internal integration problems? So what you're trying to do with your SOA and the maturity of that deployment is an important factor in planning for your governance as well. You want to then develop your SOA governance vision and strategy. Now we've talked about the principles, so this is where you identify your principles, get those articulated and bought into by your stakeholders, of course. And then you develop your SOA governance scope. This is also where you can take a look at what your current governance needs are, what your vision is, and figuring out what scope you want to do immediately as maybe as well as in the future. Developing the SOA governance principles, and then finally developing that SOA governance roadmap. So here's where you can actually codify what the different cycles to the SOA governance vitality model will be. So let's look at the define phase. So now we know what it is that we want to achieve. So now we're going to actually define what the governed SOA processes are. We take a look at the SOA solution and the problem that we're trying to govern, and we figure out which processes do I actually need to put governance regimen in place for. I then define the governing SOA processes for it. So I define the compliance process, what checkpoints do I need, what metrics and KPIs are important, how often do they need to be checked, what's my dispensations process, how am I going to deal with exceptions to this, and can I automate any of these so that they don't have to be run by people individually. So now we're going to collect together the guidelines and the standards that are going to be appropriate for the SOA governance that is being put into place. We define now our organization. We find the roles and responsibilities that are appropriate for my company, find the right stakeholders, get everybody committed. Then we define all the information artifacts. I'm going to need policies and processes and procedures put in place. And then finally create the transition plans. The transition plans are key because this is actually all of the step-by-step processes that's going to be necessary to go from what governance I have now to the governance that I want to have at the end of this cycle through the vitality model. And we'll have to create governance plans for the organization, the processes, and the technology. So the implementation phase then becomes merely, well, I say merely, but it's the biggest bulk of the work at this point in the process, taking those transition plans from now to where I want to be and implementing them. At an organization level, putting boards into place, hiring the right skills. At a process level, developing the processes, getting them implemented, getting checkpoints put into your existing development infrastructures, and technology, making sure that the information is available and the right communications can be done. And now finally, the monitor phase. So the monitor phase, we've talked about a lot throughout this presentation, and it's key to making sure that we maintain the alignment. So you monitor and you evaluate the governed processes. So we have compliance processes in place that are running sort of continually, and so we checkpoints occur out of those, and we make sure that they're handled appropriately. And one thing that we want to do is notice that if we get a lot of exceptions for certain checkpoints or certain KPIs, then this should be a trigger to us. This is almost another kind of metric or KPI, is the number of exceptions. For us to go back and reevaluate the policies and the metrics and the KPIs that we have in place. Exceptions should be a rare thing, not a day-to-day thing. Now we go back and we monitor and evaluate the governing processes, making sure that they're still working appropriately, and there should be metrics and KPIs in place for them as well. And then now, really, we also want to monitor external changes, right? This is about business and IT alignment. So we want to make sure that the current processes that are in place are in the right place for the business. So then there have been business strategy changes. Have there been other external changes like new laws coming from Congress that need to be adhered to, new stakeholders that have joined the company, other organizational changes like we've bought new companies or integrated new departments. So there are a lot of different external changes that can occur to cause us to want to evaluate the current SOA development and see and the governance that's available for it, and see if we need to reevaluate and run through that cycle again. So that's the governance framework. In summary, the SOA governance does provide a way for business and IT alignment to provide and make sure that you get that value that SOA has been promised you. It does address some key concerns for SOA. Some of the concerns and angst that we often hear with organizations deploying SOA is understanding which services I need to deploy, understanding and making sure I get the right ownership and funding, making sure I get the right reuse and development. And by deploying a governance framework in a methodological way, like we've outlined here, you can make sure that these questions are answered in a timely manner and in a consistent manner. So the governance framework standard, summarized, is a vendor-to-neutral framework developed from the best practices and experienced vendor implementations. And as I have shared, we have a lot of best practices and lists from people to choose from in order to create their own appropriate governance regimen for their company. This governance applies to companies really of any size and SOA projects of any size. You have to keep track in order to keep the value that you want to get from SOA. It is extensible and customizable and is meant to be created specifically for your organization. All right, and that wraps it up. Any questions?
Well, as I say, if people would like to put in questions through the chat, I have a couple of questions that have sort of come up that people have asked me that I thought it might be nice to pass on to the experts. And while people are putting their questions in on chat, maybe I can ask the first of these.
Chris, there are actually 3 questions out on the Q&A.
Are there? Ah, okay. Well, let's take those then. I'm not seeing the questions for some reason.
Oh, they're down in the Q&A section at the bottom.
That's what I'm looking at.
I see 2.
Oh.
So
the first one is from Andreas Amunden. How is SOA governance different from BPM governance? Aren't these just different ways of slicing the cake, different ways of approaching governance? Both are valid, but not necessarily useful at the same time.
I can take this one. This is Jorge. So certainly SOA and BPM are two worlds that complement each other. So you can think of a Venn diagram. And there are certain things that apply whenever we are talking about the same kind of things. So if we're talking about the same kind of things, probably the same kind of governance needs to be applied to complement things. I should think of a different word instead of things. But so if putting specifics, when you're dealing with BPM, you're dealing with how can I improve and manage, etc., processes. So from an SOA perspective, we're focusing on services. Now, there are instances in which companies really want to have those processes connect to services. And in that situation, we will say that we will be reusing something. So this framework still applies. And to answer your specifically question, how is governance different from BPM? So it's one is focusing purely on process, and the other on services. But many of the mechanisms like COE and other things still apply. You might have to have, say, like a process board or other things for BPM, but that do not particularly apply to SOA governance, but they're fairly complementary. All right. And Andreas had another question, I think.
Yes.
Right. Does SOA governance assume or depend on the business being service-oriented as well? And the answer is no. There's no assumption that the business has reorganized itself to follow the service sort of paradigm. I mean, it will be nice, and certainly there is the push. That's in a way where you can approach governance from a variety of perspectives, and if the idea is to really bring the business in closer alignment to IT, I think that's a key one. I mean, that the business needs to look at how they're defining the various functions that they have, and forget about technology. I mean, how can they make sure that their value chains execute as efficient as possible, and more likely, in personal opinion, that they need to look at. And by the way, this ties together with the other question of BPM. I mean, probably there will be some BPM effort to drive that transformation, and that. So to answer your question, there's an assumption, no, but certainly it's complementary. Heather, you said that you saw a third question.
Yeah, Simon also has a third question, which is SOA governance, the way you perceive it, something that requires alignment across the entire enterprise?
Entire enterprise. So we might have to qualify that a bit, but certainly, as you were saying, Heather, I mean, there are various people that need to be brought together to create alignment, and whatever the stakeholders for the scope that you have in front of you, that they're the ones that need to be there. So we talk about business and IT alignment. Another one that I would bring forward is development and operations alignment. So in your particular mechanisms for governance, you will have representatives from all of those, and there might be particular function areas within the business that have really strategic initiatives, like there may be in an insurance company some claims reorganization and billing, or surety and banking, some wealth management or something else. Representative of those will also be part of your governance mechanisms.
Yeah, I think Andreas is really pushing on the scope of governance question, which is, and I think, just to point out or reiterate what Jorge has said, is that you can really set any scope for the governance that you need to put in place for your SOA solutions. Even if your SOA solutions have a much larger scope, you can pick particular problem areas of your SOA solution and put together a governance regimen for that, and keep increasing the amount of governance you get if you don't have the liberty of being able to get executive backing on down to the other way. I think certainly the solution will probably be more successful if you can get alignment across the enterprise. but certainly it's not essential in order to get benefits from the governance.
And Jeff had a question. Chris, maybe this is one question that you can answer. Will soft copy of this presentation be made available?
And I think the answer to that question is yes. The question is as to how it is to be made available. I think we should post it. When we say soft copy, that would be a PDF rather than the original PowerPoint. But we will post a soft copy to the SOA work group main page, which will be www.opengroup.org/projects/SOA.
All right. And I think Jeff had another question.
Yes.
Does this framework speak to integration with CCMI processes? So not explicitly, and we made the explicit decision of not expanding of maturity, other than that we need to do it. And Heather went over the various activities within the phases of the method, and one of them is to certainly make sure that you understand what maturity level you are in maturity activities. But yeah, that could be an extension to things, or maybe some future version, or etc. But they're just not. It was not within scope for this first iteration.
I think that's all the questions that we have from the audience. Chris,
there should be. I think there should be some more questions, although I can't see them. Simon said there were 9.
Oh, I can only see 4.
Oh, there's one more. Jeff is asking, could you repeat the URL where you can get the PDF?
Why don't we type it in?
Let me send it.
Chris, why don't you type it into the chat?
Let's try if I answer that. And let me double check before I do that I'm in the right place. It's not there yet, but it will appear in the place that I'm telling you.
All right. Chris, do you have some other questions?
Yes, if there aren't, if Simon knows of any that we haven't answered that aren't showing, but I have a couple of questions. What are the things in your experience that people most often ask for dispensation for? The governance framework has a nice mechanism whereby there is compliance, and you can ask for dispensation from having to comply to various things. What kind of things tend to come up when people are saying, can we have dispensation for this or for that?
All right. So this is Jorge again. Well, there in a typical big company that there are various at times a couple of life cycles that projects follow, right? So if a project is below 100K or $1 million or something else, you go to different places. And depending on what we've put as control points, they may say that they may want to not go through particular things. Like I'm trying to to think of examples, but that sort of going either to one process or another is one thing that I know that I'm actually experiencing at one of my current customers, and we have to tweak certain governance things to make sure that they went through, which actually is just a signature, but that's irrelevant. Other things, well, it also depends on what we want them to do and where they are today. So dispensation on, for example, if we want to follow particular templates for that defines what a service is, so some sort of a litmus test on what the service is, and now we're defining that they have to complete certain things and they have to answer it in a certain way. They might say that, hey, for this first year in which we're going to go through, do not let's sort of skip this and build our expertise, and then afterwards bring some of those governing mechanisms. Another thing is, for example, to be dispensated from going through control mechanisms, although this relates to the first thing that I mentioned, but because the current ones that are managed by IT governance, the IT governance group, are too, there is a particular process that is too cumbersome for this initial state of SOA. So it centers around that given that we are sort of initiating a lot of these SOA efforts, there needs to be a more fluid way of bringing value quickly. And if we start putting many of the things that should be there eventually, it may slow down. So kind of we are in startup mode in a way, and those are some of the things, I guess. Because at the beginning we sort of show what control points should be there, and sometimes people say, I understand that that's important, but can we skip them for now?
Okay, so do you have thoughts on this, Heather?
Well, some of the ones I hear about sometimes are reuse of services. So there might be a policy to enforce certain reuse of services so we don't have duplicates. And it could be that an organization wants to duplicate a service because it has existing legacy systems that it's comfortable with. It's hard to get used to using someone else's code and giving up control. So that's sometimes an exception that comes up.
Okay. And those two answers are very interesting. Reuse of services and also dispensation from particular formats, and people saying that they want to get things done more quickly, and I guess these are sort of common things that come up in any kind of development, but not only SOA. Do you think, though, that would you see the kind of examples that you brought up? Are these things where you should be telling the teams, no, you've got to carry on, do things according to the prescribed formats, reuse the services that are there, or is this a case where you would say, okay, you can have a dispensation and we'll feed this into the vitality process and maybe change the governance regimen going forward to improve it?
Yeah, well, the core of the matter here is, why are you doing SOA? And whatever strategy that you come up of why you're doing SOA is what we're building the governance around. So if what the key for you to go into governance is agility, not necessarily reuse, then we're gonna put the governance mechanism in place to encourage the achievement of that. Now we can say that maybe as part of that agility, we might choose reuse as some of the strategies for achieving such agility. But so what I'm trying to say is that whether we reuse or not, that matters only if that matters to your core goals.
So I can see it going either way, depending on, as Jorge said, how quickly does something need to be delivered, might weigh in on, well, okay, we give you dispensation, but you've got 3 months to get this fixed in order to meet some particular time-critical schedule. But certainly, dispensation shouldn't, and exceptions should not be granted without a lot of thought and motivation.
Do you kind of see this as maybe traditional governance processes needing to be made more flexible to cope with SOA?
Made more flexible. Well, so traditional.
Or maybe to put it another way, do you see that the framework is, if you like, enabling SOA governance processes to be more flexible, to allow for greater agility than traditional frameworks?
Well, I'm experiencing that a lot of IT governance. So we're talking about that, I guess, not corporate governance and others. But a lot of IT governance efforts, they are working, they're evolving at becoming as agile as they can be. So now bringing SOA brings actually a nice test to them, because are they agile enough to now worry about controlling things at the service level as a unit of value for the business? Some of them are like, no, we might need to tweak certain things, and that's where us in the SOA governance area, we can help them see where in their life cycles they need to sort of put extra checks or do this or that certain things are too strict, I guess. But I think that it's something that works hand in hand. I mean, sure, they need to become a bit more flexible if they have not been worrying about IT governance agility. But if they have, I think that's a nice collaboration, and it perhaps not as bad. I mean, they don't have to work too much on changes, but certainly I doubt that if they have not thought about services, that they're going to have all the things that they need to enable the correct execution of SOA governance the way that we were thinking about. I mean, at the service level, I mean, control things like how do we control that others are not just making up what a service is, say the granularity of a service. That probably, those kind of checks are not in the architectural review board checklist, probably, assuming that that's sort of the mechanisms that they're following. So it's a mixture, it's a combination, and it depends on whether there has been already an effort of increasing agility in IT governance. And if so, you have an easier road.
Okay. If that's where we are on that question, I have unless Simon's going to tell me, for some reason I'm not seeing all the Q&A that's coming in, unless Simon's telling me that there are further questions sort of in the pipeline. There's another area that comes up, I think, quite often. And we have, in fact, had a question, does the framework speak to integration with CMMI processes? People also ask about integration with COBIT or with ITIL. And we're saying that there will be SOA governance boards. Do we actually need separate SOA governance boards, or would they be integrated with general architecture governance boards within most enterprises?
Okay, so the last one, I mean, there are a couple of different ones. One we're talking a board for, say, for a COE, right? So if there's an SOA SOA COE, and well, there's got to be a board or a steering committee or something that drives that particular COE. So it's particular to that. That's different than an architectural review board that has a more general sort of architectural governing kind of scope. And we're not saying that there will be a totally separate board. Apart from that board, there will be more likely complementary efforts in which now we have our SMEs that know about SOA that participate in that board and help to tweak whatever mechanisms, either checklists or interviews or whatever else they have, to focus on the right service level things. So two different boards. We're not saying that we create new things apart from the architectural review board. Of course, if there is no such a thing, then one will be created with an extreme focus on SOA, but more likely will serve as a more general one as well.
Okay. Have a question just come in here from Michelle Tremblay. Maybe we could give this one to Heather. What about the leadership that is required to implement governance, whether it is SOA related or otherwise? So where does the leadership that is required for governance come from?
Well, I think it ties back to the scope question that we talked about earlier, and that if you have if you have a SOA solution and your business is very fundamentally becoming services oriented, then the leadership often comes from high-level executives and high-level technical individuals in the company to provide that leadership and that support for those trying to actually implement and monitor it ongoing. If you're in a smaller company, or if you're in a company where part of the company is working on a SOA solution, it's in one particular division, or it's limited to a particular part of the business just yet, then the leaders for the governance and the stakeholders for that might be somebody, a division lead, or a CTO of that area. So it depends on the scope of the SOA solution, and it depends on the scope of the governance that you're trying to take a look at on where that leadership would come from.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Jorge?
I think that was a pretty good answer. I mean, if I could add a couple things, would be that, or one thing is that specifically they're typically, whenever you're doing SOA and you're introducing it into an organization, that there will be some champion, somebody that has that is well connected, and that has good reference within the technical and executive committees leadership. So I would say that you need that kind of person, that kind of leader to drive this. And certainly from a governance perspective, because a large percentage of that is just understanding the context and the politics. So I'll just say that kind of leader needs to be identified, and that once you have that person, then the rest will become more apparent on who exactly needs to be convinced, the stakeholders, etc. Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jorge, and thanks, Heather, for the answers to that question, and for your presentations and explanations. I think we're coming up to the hour now, so unless anyone has any further burning questions that they want to put in, I suggest we will close the webinar at this point. And thank you, as I said, to Jorge and Heather, and thank you to everyone who attended and participated and asked questions. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. The presentation will, as I said, be posted in PDF form on the SOA workgroup page in the location that I posted in the Q&A, which I hope everyone could see. So thank you everyone, and and good night. Well, for me, or good day for you in the States.
Thank you.